Hi folks, welcome to my Archaeology of Disease Part 3. This week we're going to take a little look at anthrax and then open up to the absolutely amazing, fantastic, wonderful Black Death. But to really understand and to get to grips with understanding the cataclysmic events that led up to and was in fact the Black Death, looking at all the other diseases help us understand where we've got to. As I've already said, Black Death really comes in a number of forms associated with other diseases in its wake. Most diseases themselves, like leprosy, aren't necessarily killers by themselves, but when you add something like typhus into the mix, it's almost fatal. Something like the Black Death, we've come to understand, isn't helped by people having a bad diet. And when your body is very weakened, the Black Death takes its toll quite rapidly. If you've got a healthy body and you've got a fairly good diet, your chances of survival are a little bit higher. But when you throw something like anthrax in the mix, you're going to die. So let's start off with anthrax. Anthrax itself is a bacterium known as Bacillus anthracis. Most forms of anthrax are lethal. They affect a wide range of animals, mainly herbivorous animals. But when transmitted to carnivores such as a human, it can be, in most cases, fatal. It's transmitted with direct contact or consumption of the infected meat. There are effective vaccines today, but back in the day, 700 years ago, 800 years ago, and further, anthrax was fatal. And when you put something like the Black Death in the mix, then you're going to die. Anthrax itself is a sporal form of bacterium, which can survive through harsh conditions. Spores of anthrax are associated directly with the human being across the planet. Anthrax spores have been found in, for example, Antarctica. Spores, when inhaled, ingested, or come in close contact with skin, a skin lesion, a cut of some form, rapidly multiply after reactivation. So there are examples of it surviving hundreds and hundreds of years. Anthrax can be ingested by herbivorous animals whilst they graze. The spores actively spread across fields. And of course, humans eating that flesh, yes, anthrax spreads. We've got an illustration here floating around in the background of me talking of how anthrax can spread on a skin lesion. These are just some spores multiplying, eating away at the flesh all the way down to the bone. And it's been seen in the modern weaponized form that it's seen to be stockpiled by some countries, including the United Kingdom, Russia, United States, and the likes of Japan, for chemical bioweapons. Anthrax today is still relatively active, and it has a very long lifespan. For example, disturbed graves fairly in recent times of infected animals have caused reinfection over 70 years, very, very active since the animal's internment. And therefore, this is why we burn the flesh of animals, bodies of animals that have been infected with anthrax. But the spores can still survive. Some archaeologists, historians do believe that anthrax was associated quite closely with the Black Death. From 1300, for example, to 1315, the human population of England alone is said to have been increasing up to 7 million people. I usually use that figure, 7 million, to be the whole population of Britain, but some historians say it was just actually 7 million population of England, which is quite phenomenal. Cattle was on the increase. Cattle was the chosen meat source, because cattle itself was very sought after and needed to be kept in check so that it couldn't be rustled. People would have the animals in their homes, and therefore the dung of the animals, if they were infected with anthrax, would then get into human cuts with the lack of sanitation in our homes, and we would be infected with anthrax. One piece of archaeological evidence was that when a plague pit was excavated from dating all the way back to about 1349, 1350, the plague pit itself contained anthrax spores, which were seemingly could be reactivated at any time. So hence archaeologists working on such sites need to wear protection. Cattle is said to have spread Cattle is said to have traded from Scotland into England, spreading anthrax and the anthrax spores. It's not just to be seen descriptions of anthrax and how it affects the skin. We see descriptions in the Christian world, the Muslim and Chinese world of anthrax. So at the same time as the plague, symptoms of the plague vary from community to community. So this is why we associate other diseases with the Black Death. Black Death comes in 3 different forms, which we'll see in a short while. Spore penetration and its spread, exposure itself can get very to the point of infection causing septicemic problems and various other infections, can spread to kill you within 5 days unless it's treated. Anthrax itself is seen with respiratory problems and flu-like and cold-like symptoms, and slowly but surely it's historically anthrax has a death rate, wait for it, of 92%. People would also vomit blood, they would have severe diarrhea, acute inflammation of the intestinal tract, and loss of appetite, and toxins would go through the bloodstream. Some of those symptoms very similar to cholera. So historians in the past found it very difficult to work out which was which or what was going on. Now, what I want us to do, this is now part 1 of 2 parts, looking specifically now at the Black Death and now linking anthrax into the Black Death and everything that we've already done. Years of pestilence, burial pits and rotting carcasses, death and despair, long-term changes were ahead after the Black Death, which ruled England, Wales and Scotland and Ireland between 1348 and 1351. Like myself, ranting chroniclers would write about the diaspora of the human condition and the Black Death killing multitudes. It's likely that England, we saw a drop of population between the mini ice age from 1315 all the way to 1352, a drop in population from 7 million to 2 million. And you can imagine a death. Most of those deaths come in the late 1340s when Black Death really hits. But before that, other diseases are having their score. Anthrax, typhus, and so on. And these obviously then weakening the people. Crops are failing up until 1348. Due to this mini ice age where there were wetter conditions and so on. Black Death itself is to be seen by some historians as something that is given to God's displeasure. People having sexual fashions that aren't appropriate at the time, God punishing people. Pestilentia in England during 1348 when it arrives in late summer flourishes within the hot conditions. It was initially the bubonic form which, as in the word, buboids, could be spread by the bite of a flea, a departing, a dying rat. Then the following year, 1349, we saw the pneumonic plague. The breathing, kissing, coughing and sneezing could spread it. Ring-a-ring-a-rosies, a pocket full of toesies, a tissue, we all fall down. That's believing coming from the pneumonic form. And then, a year or so later, that was the septicemic strain of plague, which was completely fatal and does not have any form of antidote today. It's calculated that up to 200 million people died in Europe between 1347, when it hit Europe in 1347, took a year to get to us, all the way through to 1352. 200 million people. Our population of Europe of about 300 million. Some towns and cities had a death rate of 90%. Some villages in England had a death rate of nearly 100%. And one person left to bury the dead in communities of 150 people. This is not to be confused with the Great Plague of London in 1665. But the Black Death didn't disappear in 1352. It kept coming and coming and coming. With the Black Death itself, we'll see a great more detail next week. The Black Death itself cometh to destroy various towns and villages in England. Not all villages, deserted medieval villages, DMVs we call them in archaeology, were lost as an effect of the Black Death. A large amount of them, however, I would say 80% of the villages in England that were seen as deserted medieval villages and deserted by 1400 were wiped out due to the plague. And those that left despaired and left for the towns and cities to work for better wages. We can see this in documentary sources as well, and those people that were left were less valuable to the landowners, and they were replaced with sheep and forced to leave the land anyway. The growth of the black rat population is being traced through the analysis of rat bones from excavations, not just through hearsay from documents. Urizensis pestis, the bubonic plague, is to be seen as something horrendous that in Montpellier in France, south of the country, it's believed up to 90% of the population died from the disease. 90%! Archaeologists can find Black Death on the bones of victims by bacterial DNA, and also we're now starting to look within the space of those 5 days that these 3 strains of plague would kill you. The bacteria would actually make its way into the tooth, and we're getting good fixtures of forms of the DNA, particularly septicemic plague in the teeth. So that's good. We're actually getting that from graves. Excavated mass graves is to be seen with great caution. Wear masks and all the rest of it. Contemporaries, for example, at Rochester would say of the dead in the graveyard at Rochester, the town of Rochester, Roman, ex-city, it would be said at the time, contemporary writing, from which arose such a stink that it was barely possible to go past a churchyard. And that was the terror of the time. Initially, when the Black Death hit London, by late 1348, people were being buried in trenches, communal trenches. But by the following year, with the pneumonic plague hitting London, people were just stuffed in pits, piled in ditches, anywhere that they could get rid of the bodies, haphazardly buried. Descriptions of people being pushed in wheelbarrows, just dumped in holes, and then them being infected. Interesting stuff next week as well. Unsurprisingly, the old and young alike, men, women and children, rich and poor, all stuffed in holes and no time to even mark them. Let's look at this next point. The black rat. Today, apart from a colony of black rats that holds out on Lundy Island, the black rat has been ousted from Britain by the brown rat, Rattus novigacus, which arrived here from Norway in the 1700s. But in the 1300s, there was an explosion growth in the black rat. Now, we know this not just from the historical record. A number of dock sites at Southampton were excavated in the late 1940s due to the bombing there. So we're excavating early sort of storage structures for rebuild of Southampton, and in the 1960s and later. Interestingly enough, the archaeologists found virtually no rat bones within the depth of the archaeology in Southampton between 1100 and 1225. There were very few rats. But by 1250 and 1350, there's an explosion in the rat population associated with human beings, an explosion in the human population. And interestingly enough, they started to find quite a correlation here. And one interesting thing, up until 1250, before we see an increase in the rat population, the bone record only saw the remains of one cat and one dog in the archaeological record. But between the same period of 1250 and 1350, when we see an explosion in rats, we see the remains of 10 dogs and 28 cats, amazingly enough, to deal with this rat invasion, cause and effect. Dogs were being born yes, they were being born. Dogs themselves were being created and formed to have short noses, fox terrier sized dogs that could rat out the rats from various holes. And then, interestingly enough, after the plague, guess what? Not only the rat population after 1352 decreased, the dog and cat population after 1352 decreased as well. Now, coming to an end of this as well, I think it would be interesting to look at some of the after effects. So next week we'll be looking a great more detail at the plague. Part 2 next week. Now, one thing is this. After the plague had done its worst, we not only see the change in the countryside, towns and cities, but suddenly development innovations ceased. Techniques deteriorated. Skilled craftsmen were simply wiped out and could not complete the cathedrals and chapels that they were building at the time. Imports of glass were having to be brought over because even our glass industry collapsed. Our pottery industry collapsed. Everything collapsed, and it took another 50 years for whole building projects to revamp again, with the workmen actually coming over. Likes of Winchester Cathedral is noted that the west front, the west gable, with the beautiful decorated windows, was still scaffolded, and this whole frontage was not being worked on for 25 years after the plague had done its worst by 1352. And they only started resuming work in 1370. The decorated style of building, which had become more ornate, was replaced gradually by 1400 by a very straight angular form, the perpendicular form of buildings. So the plague had subtle things and changes in even structures, and we'll see it had even more catastrophic effect later. Even the building of timber frame buildings, which had been lavish up until the plague in the 1340s, building out of timber completely changed. One final point must be said, is that the plague itself wrought itself out to make each individual life after 1352 more valuable than it ever had been. Those people were not prepared to accept conditions on the land that they had had before and work as basically serfs and slaves of the land, so they would go to the towns and cities. And many of the landowners were dead anyway, so they could just simply leave. And therefore they were valued. And now we start to see, as we do today, the introduction of money, because people were no longer wishing to work for kind. They were now working for money, so they would now, most of these people would have money, silver coins in their pockets for the first time. Anyway, thanks for listening to my video log on the Black Death, and hopefully you will listen to next week's Black Death part 2, and please subscribe to my channel. Thanks, folks.